Exiled, he built a home inside a giant pipe. Asa Morrigan, who had survived 17 Colorado winters, told him plainly, "A banished man doesn't winter in this canyon. You'll die alone, and no one will bury you." He had $6, a dying mule, and needed shelter he could not build. On May 14th, 1887, the creek rose 12 feet in 40 minutes. But 7 months earlier, Silas Crenshaw had never sealed a rivet joint or dug a trench deeper than his own knees. He stood at the edge of Elkhart with everything he owned on a lame mule. $6 in his pocket, a bedroll, a cookpot, an axe with a loose head. The sun was setting behind the peaks, and the men who had just banished him were already walking back to their suppers. September 28th, 1886. The aspens had turned gold 3 days earlier. In 6 weeks, the first hard freeze would lock this canyon in ice. Silas had worked as a teamster in Colorado's mining camps for 8 years. He knew how to drive a wagon through a mountain pass in a snowstorm. He knew how to keep mules alive when the temperature dropped to 20 below. What he did not know was how to build a shelter that would keep a man breathing through a San Juan winter. The charge against him was theft. $32 missing from the Gloriana Mines Company safe. Silas had been seen near the office that night. He had gone to retrieve his pay stub, nothing more, and that was enough. Thomas Caldwell, the mine superintendent, chaired the Vigilance Committee. Caldwell's nephew Everett had left for California 2 weeks before the money went missing. No one mentioned Everett. No one asked questions about timing. The vote was 6-1 for banishment. 48 hours to leave Elkhart or face hanging. Silas had used those 48 hours to buy what supplies he could afford: flour, salt, coffee, a handful of rifle cartridges. The shopkeeper had charged him double, knowing Silas had no choice and no recourse. Now he led his mule up the canyon trail, away from the only settlement within 50 miles, into country where the nearest help was a 2-day ride through terrain that would be impassable by November. He made camp that night beside a creek that ran clear and cold over granite stones. The water would freeze solid in 8 weeks. The creek bed would fill with snow, and Silas would be somewhere in this canyon, either alive or dead, with no one to know the difference. He found the old mine foreman on the second day. Asa Morrigan was 53 years old, with a face like cracked leather and hands that had swung a pickaxe since before Silas was born. He had worked the Gloriana for 9 years. He had survived 17 Colorado winters, and he had cast the only vote against Silas's banishment. Morrigan found Silas 2 miles up canyon, trying to build a lean-to from fallen branches. The structure looked like something a child might make. It would not survive the first real wind. The old man stood watching for a long moment. Then he spoke. "A banished man doesn't winter in this canyon." His voice was flat, without sympathy. "The creek will rise in spring and take whatever shack you build. You'll die alone, and no one will bury you." Silas kept working on his useless lean-to. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "Then you'll die here." Morrigan walked closer, examining the construction with obvious contempt. "You know what it takes to survive a winter at 9,000 feet? 8 cords of firewood, minimum. A cabin with double walls and a stone foundation. Root cellar for your food stores. You're one man with a lame mule and $6. The math doesn't work." "I'll figure something out." "No, you won't." Morgan pulled a tobacco pouch from his coat and began rolling a cigarette. "I've seen men try. Experienced men. Trappers who knew these mountains. They die in January when the cold gets into their bones, or they die in May when the snowmelt comes down like God's own fury." He lit the cigarette and watched the smoke rise. "This canyon floods every spring, every single spring. I've seen it twice, 79 and 83. The creek rises 12, 15 feet in a matter of hours. Anything built on the canyon floor gets swept away like it was never there. Silas stopped working. Then where do people build? Higher ground. But higher ground means hauling timber uphill, means building on slopes that want to slide, means twice the work for half the shelter. Morgan shook his head. You don't have the time. You don't have the tools. You don't have the money. And you don't have anyone who's going to help you, because helping a banished man means joining him. The silence stretched between them. Somewhere down the canyon, a raven called. You voted against it, Silas said. The banishment. I did. Why? Morgan finished his cigarette and ground it under his boot. Because Caldwell's nephew was a thief, and everyone knew it. Because the money went missing the same week Everett left town. Because you were just a teamster in the wrong place. He met Silas's eyes. But being right doesn't matter when you're outvoted 6-1, and it doesn't matter now, because you're still banished and I'm still bound by the committee's decision. He turned to leave, then stopped. There's an old claim 2 miles further up, the Josephine, played out in '84. They left some equipment behind, too heavy to haul out, not worth enough to bother. He did not look back. Might be something useful, might not. I was never here. We never spoke. Then he was gone, and Silas was alone with his useless lean-to and his dying mule and $6 that wouldn't buy a single cord of firewood. Was I any? The Josephine claim looked like a graveyard for machines. Silas reached it on the last day of September. The mine entrance had collapsed years ago, leaving a dark mouth half filled with rubble. The stamp mill had fallen in on itself, timbers rotted and scattered. Rust covered everything, the rails, the ore carts, the iron fittings that had once held this operation together. But one piece of equipment remained intact. The boiler sat at the base of a steep hillside, 30 feet above the canyon floor. It was massive, a cylinder of riveted iron, 6 feet in diameter and 22 feet long. The fire tubes had been stripped out years ago, salvaged for scrap, but the shell itself was untouched, too heavy to move, too solid to collapse, just sitting there waiting. Silas walked around it slowly. He ran his hands along the riveted seams. The iron was quarter-inch plate, still sound despite years of weather. The cylinder was watertight. It had been designed to hold pressurized steam. No rust had penetrated the joints. He stood back and looked at the hillside behind it. The slope rose at a steep angle, dirt and loose rock held together by tree roots. A man with a shovel could dig into that hillside, could excavate a trench, could roll this iron cylinder into the trench and bury it under 5 feet of earth. The thought came to him all at once, complete and terrible. A buried iron pipe, sealed at both ends with timber, covered with earth for insulation. The iron would keep out water. The earth would keep out cold. The whole structure would sit 30 feet above the canyon floor, above any floodline Morgan had described. It was insane. No one had ever lived inside a buried pipe. Greta Holtz, the widow who lived at the canyon mouth, would call him a madman. The miners would laugh themselves sick. And if it failed, if the seals leaked, if the earth collapsed, if the iron conducted cold instead of blocking it, he would die in a frozen metal tomb, and no one would find his body until spring. But he had $6. He had no timber, no nails, no tools for building a proper cabin. He had one man's labor and 6 weeks before the ground froze solid. The conventional math didn't work. Morgan had made that clear. 8 cords of firewood for a man alone was impossible. A cabin with double walls and a stone foundation was impossible. But this rusted cylinder that everyone had abandoned, this might work. Silas walked the site again, measuring with his stride. The trench would need to be 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep, 26 feet long. That was 40 cubic yards of earth, minimum. 160 hours of digging, maybe more. He had 6 weeks. It would be close. Greta Holtz was the first to tell him he was digging his own grave. She lived in a cabin at the canyon mouth, technically outside Elkhart's jurisdiction. Her husband had died in a tunnel collapse at the Gloriana 3 years earlier. She survived by trading with travelers and trappers, selling eggs from her chickens and vegetables from her garden. She was 41 years old, with gray streaking her dark hair and a face that had stopped expecting kindness from the world. Silas traded with her in late October, 2 rabbit pelts for salt and coffee. She asked what he was building up canyon. He told her. The look on her face was something between pity and horror. "You're digging your own grave, Mr. Crenshaw." She set the salt on her counter with a thump. "Iron sweats and cold. You'll wake up soaked every morning and catch lung fever by Christmas. And that boiler's got no windows. You'll go mad in the dark before spring." She shook her head. "I've seen dugouts fail. My first winter here, 3 families tried living underground. The creek flooded and drowned them in their beds. Underground is for the dead." "The boiler is 30 feet above the creek," Silas said. "And I'm sealing it with tar and oakum. It won't flood." "The flood line moves." Greta's voice was hard. "Every old-timer in this canyon will tell you that. The creek rose 22 feet in Deadwood Gulch back in '83. 22 feet. You build where you think is safe, and then God decides to teach you different. I don't have another choice. You have the same choice everyone has. Build a proper cabin or leave." "I can't build a cabin. I don't have the materials or the time." "Then leave." She pushed the salt toward him. "Go to Creed. Find work. Come back in spring when you've got money and daylight. There's no shame in retreating from a fight you can't win." Silas took the salt, the coffee. He did not answer, because there was no answer that would satisfy her. He could not go to Creed without crossing territory that Elkhart's patrols watched. He could not find work without references, and the only reference he had was a banishment order signed by Thomas Caldwell. He was trapped in this canyon. The buried pipe was his only way out. Greta watched him go with the expression of someone watching a man walk toward a cliff. The digging nearly killed him. Silas started on October 15th, working from first light until he could no longer see his shovel. The hillside was a mix of loose shale and compacted clay, frozen on the surface each morning, thawing to mud by afternoon. He dug through tree roots thick as his wrist. He pried out stones that weighed more than he did. He hauled bucket after bucket of earth down the slope, dumping it in piles that would later become his burial cover. By November 1st, he had moved 18 cubic yards. The trench was 4 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 12 feet long, less than halfway. His hands split open in the first week. He wrapped them in strips torn from his spare shirt and kept digging. The blood soaked through the cloth and froze in the cold. He kept digging. His back seized on November 4th. He spent a full day lying flat on the frozen ground, unable to move, staring at the sky and wondering if this was how it ended, not in a blizzard, not in a flood, but in a muscle spasm that left him helpless until the cold took him. He got up on November 5th and kept digging. The mule died on November 8th. Old age, exhaustion, the cold. Silas never knew which. He woke to find the animal stiff beside the remnants of his lean-to, eyes glazed, breath long gone. He butchered it for meat. The hide he stretched over a frame of branches to dry. Nothing could be wasted. By November 9th, the trench was complete, 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep, 26 feet long. The raw earth walls glistened with moisture that would freeze solid within days. Now came the hard part. The boiler weighed 3 tons. Silas had no machinery, No block and tackle, no team of horses. He had rope salvaged from the Josephine debris, log rollers cut from fallen timber, and the strength left in a body that had lost 15 pounds since September. He spent 2 days building a ramp from the boiler's resting place to the lip of the trench. The angle was steep, steeper than he wanted, but the terrain gave him no choice. He positioned log rollers beneath the boiler's curved bottom, chocked with stones to keep it from moving until he was ready. On November 13th, he knocked out the first chock. The boiler shifted, groaned. The sound of iron scraping against wood filled the canyon. Silas threw his weight against the rope, pulling uphill, trying to control the descent. The boiler rolled forward 6 inches. Stopped. He repositioned the rollers, pulled again, another 6 inches. By nightfall, he had moved the boiler 8 feet. November 14th, 12 more feet. His shoulders burned. His hands bled through their wrappings. November 15th, the rope snapped. The boiler rolled backward, picking up speed on the slope, crashing through the log rollers and coming to rest exactly where it had started 3 days before. Silas stood in the fading light, staring at the cylinder that had just erased 72 hours of work. His body shook with exhaustion. His mind went blank with something that felt like despair, but was probably just fatigue. He had 11 days until December 1st. Caldwell had given him until then to move further up canyon or face consequences. The threat was likely a bluff. The committee had no legal authority, but Silas knew Caldwell could simply have him killed and claim self-defense. The deadline was real, even if the authority behind it was not. 11 days. And the boiler was back where it started. He scavenged more rope from the Josephine debris, twisted fibers that had been left to rot for 2 years. It would have to be enough. November 16th, 8 feet of progress. November 17th, 14 feet. November 18th. The boiler reached the lip of the trench, teetered for one terrible moment, and then rolled down into the excavation with a sound like thunder. Silas stood at the trench edge, gasping, watching the iron cylinder settle into its new home. The fit was nearly perfect. The curved bottom nested into the flat trench floor, leaving gaps on either side that he would fill with packed earth. The boiler was in place. Now he had to seal it. The timber came from the collapsed stamp mill. Silas pulled beams from the wreckage, dragging them uphill to the trench one at a time, 8-inch diameter logs, weathered but solid. He cut them to length with his loose-headed axe, fitting them inside the boiler's circumference like the staves of a barrel. The front wall went up first, vertical planks nailed to a circular frame with a gap left for a door. He caulked every seam with oakum, loose hemp fiber that he pounded into the cracks with a wooden mallet. Then he smeared hot tar over the oakum, sealing it against water and wind. The tar he found in barrels at the Josephine, half full and still usable. It had been used for sealing mine timbers against moisture. Now it sealed his home against death. The rear wall took 3 days. Same construction, same caulking, but with a hole cut for the stovepipe. He angled the pipe at 45 degrees, pointing upward and outward, so smoke would draw properly. The stove itself was a miracle of salvage. A cast iron camp stove, cracked along one side but still functional. He patched the crack with clay and hoped it would hold. November 26th, both end walls complete. The boiler was now a sealed tube, dark inside, smelling of tar and iron and raw earth. Now came the burial. Morgan appeared on November 22nd, while Silas was still sealing the rear wall. The old foreman came at dusk, moving quiet as a ghost. He carried a canvas sack over one shoulder. He did not smile. He did not offer greetings. "Salt pork," he said, setting the sack on the ground. 4 pounds, dried beans, 2 wool blankets. Silas stared at him. You can't. I found them abandoned at a mining camp up canyon. Morgan's voice was flat, rehearsed. Didn't belong to anyone. I figured you could use them more than the mice. Both men knew it was a lie. Morgan had bought these supplies with his own money, risking his position at the Gloriana, risking banishment himself. Why? Silas asked. Morgan looked at the half-sealed boiler, at the tar-blackened timber, at the trench walls rising around the iron cylinder like the sides of a grave. Because you might actually survive this, he said. And if you do, I want to know I helped. He picked up the empty sack. You didn't see me. I was never here. If you make it through winter, don't ever come back to Elkhart. Don't ever speak my name. He turned and walked back down the canyon, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Silas opened the sack. The salt pork was fresh, the beans dry and clean, the blankets thick wool that would hold heat through the coldest night. Charity disguised as chance, kindness hidden behind a lie. He went back to work. The burial took 9 days. Silas shoveled earth onto the sealed boiler, bucket by bucket, load by load. He climbed onto the curved iron surface and packed each layer with his boots, compacting the soil to prevent settling. 5 feet over the crown, 3 feet on the sides. The earth pressed down on the iron shell like a weighted blanket. From outside, the finished structure looked like a low mound in the hillside. A door of double-plank timber faced east. A stovepipe jutted from the top at an angle, trailing a thin wisp of smoke. It looked like a grave. December 5th. The burial was complete. That night, the first heavy snow fell, 8 inches by morning, blanketing the canyon in a white silence. Silas spent his first night inside the buried boiler on December 6th. He lit the stove with kindling and scraps, feeding it slowly until the iron box glowed dull red. The heat radiated outward, warming the air inside the sealed cylinder. He held his breath, waiting. After 2 hours, he checked the walls. Dry. No condensation, no sweating iron, nothing like Greta had predicted. After 4 hours, he checked the temperature. 62 degrees inside, with the stove burning low. Outside, the thermometer he had hung on a tree read 14 degrees. After 6 hours, he slept. He woke in darkness, disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was. The stove had burned down to embers. The air was cold, but not freezing, 54 degrees, he guessed. The iron walls curved around him like the ribs of some great beast. He was alive. The shelter was working. But December's cold was mild compared to what was coming. The real test would be January, when temperatures dropped to 20 below, 30 below, when the cold killed men in their sleep and froze spit before it hit the ground. And beyond January waited the greater test. Spring, the snow melt, the flood that Morgan had warned about, that Greta had warned about, that every old-timer in the canyon knew was coming. Silas had built above the flood line, 30 feet above the normal creek bed. But Greta's words echoed in his mind. The flood line moves. How high would the water rise this year? He fed another log to the stove and listened to the wind howling outside, muffled by 5 feet of earth, and wondered if he had built a shelter or a coffin. January came with teeth. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero on the night of January 14th, 1887. Silas lay in his buried pipe and listened to the wind screaming across the canyon, a sound like something dying. The stove burned hot, consuming wood faster than any night before, and still the cold crept in around the door seams, around the stovepipe collar, through every gap he had failed to seal perfectly. He checked the thermometer at midnight. 48 degrees inside. Outside, the mercury had dropped below the lowest mark, colder than 30 below, colder than the instrument could measure. His breath fogged in the candlelight. He fed another log to the stove and pulled both of Morgan's blankets around his shoulders. By morning, the temperature inside had stabilized at 51 degrees. The walls remained dry. The iron shell, buried under 5 feet of frozen earth, had held the cold at bay while the world above turned to ice. Silas counted his firewood. He had burned nearly a quarter cord in a single night. At that rate, he would run out before February ended. But he was alive. The shelter was working. The winter passed in darkness and silence. Silas saw no one from December through February. He hunted when the weather allowed. Rabbits mostly, the occasional squirrel, once a deer that he tracked for 6 miles through waist-deep snow. He rationed Morgan's salt pork and beans, stretching them across weeks. He lost another 10 pounds, then stabilized when his body adjusted to the meager diet. The cold tested the shelter again and again. January 22nd, 28 below. January 31st, 31 below. The coldest night of the winter. Each time the buried pipe held. The interior temperature never dropped below 48 degrees with the stove burning. The thermal mass of the earth absorbed the worst of the cold and released it slowly, smoothing out the temperature swings that killed men in ordinary cabins. By March, Silas had burned just over 2 cords of firewood. A conventional cabin would have required 8. He emerged on the first warm day of March to find Greta Holtz standing at the base of his hillside mound, staring up at the smoke rising from his stovepipe. "You're alive," she said. It was not a question. "I am." She climbed the slope and examined his door, his stovepipe, the earth mounded over the buried cylinder. Her face showed nothing, not surprise, not admiration, not relief. "The winter didn't kill you," she said finally. "The spring flood will." Silas looked down at the canyon floor, where the creek ran clear and shallow over granite stones. "I built 30 feet above the normal level." "Normal?" Greta almost laughed. "There's no normal in this canyon. The flood of '83 reached 22 feet in Deadwood Gulch, higher in the Narrows. You think 30 feet is enough?" She shook her head. "The snowpack this year is deeper than I've ever seen. The old-timers in Elkhart are nervous. They're saying this could be like '83, or worse." Silas looked up at the peaks. They were still buried in white, gleaming in the March sunlight. All that snow would melt. All that water would come down. "The creek's already running high," Greta continued. "Higher than it should be for March. And we haven't had the Chinook yet." She met his eyes. "When the warm wind comes, when all that snow lets go at once, you'd better pray your 30 feet is enough." She left without trading, without offering help, without wishing him well. Her warning hung in the air like smoke. April brought the signs. The snowpack in the high peaks began to sag and settle. Streams that had been frozen solid started to run. The creek that passed through the canyon floor rose 2 feet, then 3, swelling with meltwater from above. Silas watched and measured. He carved notches in a tree near the water's edge, tracking the rise day by day. By April 10th, the creek was 4 feet above its winter level. By April 20th, it was 6 feet up and climbing. Then the Chinook came. The warm wind rolled down from the peaks on April 28th, pushing temperatures from 35 degrees to 68 in a matter of hours. Silas stood outside his buried shelter and felt the warm air on his face, strange and wrong after months of cold. The snow around him began to melt visibly, water running downhill in 1,000 tiny streams. 2 days later, the weather reversed. Wet snow fell for 18 hours straight. Then rain, heavy, pounding rain that drummed on the earth mound above his shelter and turned the hillside to mud. The creek rose to 9 feet above normal. On May 13th, the rain stopped. The sky cleared, and Silas heard something he had never heard before, a low, constant roar from somewhere up canyon, like distant thunder that never ended. He climbed to the highest point near his shelter and looked up the canyon. The creek was brown now, churning with mud and debris. Trees that had stood at the water's edge were gone, ripped away and carried downstream. The water was still rising. He went back inside and sealed the door. Morgan arrived at dusk. The old foreman was soaked to the bone, his horse wild-eyed and trembling. He had ridden hard from Elkhart, 10 miles through terrain that was rapidly becoming impassable. "They fired me," he said, standing in the doorway of the buried pipe. Water dripped from his coat, pooling on the timber floor. "Caldwell found out I voted against your banishment. Someone talked." He looked around the interior, the curved iron walls, the glowing stove, the narrow space that had kept one man alive through the worst winter in years. "I was heading to Creed, thought I could make it before the storm. I was wrong." Silas pulled him inside. The shelter that had seemed spacious for one man felt cramped with two. "The creek's rising," Morgan said, "faster than I've ever seen. The lower camps at Elkhart are already evacuating." He met Silas's eyes. "This is going to be bad." Outside, the roar grew louder. May 14th, 1887, 2 o'clock in the morning. Silas woke to a sound like the world ending. The roar had become a scream, a wall of noise that penetrated 5 feet of earth and quarter-inch iron plate. The ground shook beneath him. Somewhere above, something enormous crashed against the hillside, a tree, a boulder, a piece of someone's home torn loose and carried by the water. Morgan was already awake, pressed against the curved wall, his face pale in the candlelight. "It's here," he said. Silas moved to the door. Water was spraying through the seams, not pouring, not flooding, just a fine mist where the pressure of the flood was forcing moisture through gaps in the caulking. He pressed his hand against the timber. It was cold, wet, but holding. "The seal," Morgan said. "Is it going to hold?" "I don't know." The roar outside intensified. The pressure against the door increased. Silas could feel it, the weight of water pressing against his shelter, testing the timber, testing the tar, testing every joint and seam he had built in those desperate weeks before winter. The floor was wet now. An inch of water had seeped under the door threshold, spreading across the timber planks. Silas grabbed a blanket and shoved it against the gap, trying to slow the infiltration. "That won't stop it," Morgan said. "It doesn't have to stop it. It just has to slow it down until the water passes." They sat in darkness, the candle extinguished to conserve what little they had. The roar filled their world. The iron walls vibrated with the force of the flood. Debris struck the hillside above them. Silas could hear the impacts, feel the shudders transmitted through the earth. 3 inches of water on the floor. Morgan's breathing was ragged. "If this thing fills, it won't." Silas didn't know if that was true. "The water's hitting the hillside, not us. We're buried. The earth is taking the impact. And if the earth washes away?" Silas had no answer for that. The minutes stretched. An hour passed, maybe more. Time lost all meaning in the darkness and noise. The water on the floor rose to 4 inches, then stopped. The pressure against the door remained constant, but did not increase. Silas pressed his ear near the iron wall. The roar was beginning to fade, not quickly, not like a storm passing, but slowly, gradually, the thunder receding upstream. "It's dropping," he said. Morgan said nothing. His hands were shaking. By 6 in the morning, the roar had diminished to a steady rush. The spray through the door seams had stopped. The water on the floor had begun to drain through gaps in the timber planking. Silas unsealed the door. The canyon looked like the aftermath of war. The creek, normally 20 feet below and 100 yards distant, had risen to within 3 feet of his doorstep. The water was brown with mud, choked with debris, timber, furniture, sections of roof, a child's rocking chair spinning slowly in an eddy. The hillside above the shelter was scarred where logs had struck it, gouging trenches in the earth. One massive tree had come to rest 6 feet from the stovepipe, its roots torn up, its branches shattered. But the buried pipe stood. The earth mound was intact. The iron shell had not moved, had not cracked, had not failed. Silas and Morgan walked down the canyon toward Elkhart. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The first cabin they found was Greta Holtz's. It was gone. Not damaged, not collapsed. Gone. Swept away entirely, leaving only the stone foundation and a few splintered boards wedged against a tree downstream. Silas felt his stomach tighten. Greta had warned him about the flood line. She had told him 30 feet might not be enough. They found her a quarter-mile further down, sitting on a boulder above the waterline. She was alive, muddy, shaking, but alive. She had climbed when she heard the roar, abandoning everything she owned to reach high ground. "The canyon floor is gone," she said. Her voice was hollow. Everything below the second terrace, the miners' cabins, the supply depot, the lower works of the Gloriana. She looked at Silas with eyes that held no recognition, no memory of their arguments. "How many dead?" "We don't know yet." They kept walking. Elkhart was a ruin. The creek had risen 12 feet above normal, higher than 1879, higher than 1883, higher than anyone living could remember. The water had surged through the narrow canyon with enough force to strip soil from bedrock, to uproot trees that had stood for a century, to reduce buildings to kindling in seconds. The miners' bunkhouses near the creek were gone. 3 men had been inside, asleep when the flood hit. Their bodies were found 4 miles downstream, tangled in debris. Thomas Caldwell's house had stood on a rock outcropping 22 feet above normal creek level. The water had reached his porch. His daughter-in-law, trying to save a horse from a flooded stable, had been caught in the surge. Her body was never recovered. The Gloriana mine's lower works were filled with mud and timber. Months of cleanup, thousands of dollars in damage. The company would survive, but barely. Silas walked through the destruction with Morgan at his side. Everywhere they looked, survivors were pulling debris from the mud, searching for belongings, searching for bodies. The sound of grief filled the canyon, wailing, prayers, the silence of shock. 5 confirmed dead, 2 missing, 7 people who would never see another spring. Morgan stood outside the buried pipe 2 days later, studying the structure with new eyes. The floodwater had receded. The canyon was beginning to dry, but the evidence of the disaster remained: scoured banks, toppled trees, the raw wound where Elkhart's lower buildings used to stand. "I told you the canyon floor was a grave," Morgan said. He was not looking at Silas. He was looking at the mound, the stovepipe, the door that had held against the flood. "I said you'd die alone and no one would bury you." He shook his head slowly. "I should have told you to build like you built. That thing," he pointed at the shelter, "that's the only structure in the whole canyon that's still standing." "It almost failed," Silas said. "The door threshold leaked. If the water had risen another foot—" "But it didn't," Morgan turned to face him. The water rose 12 feet. Your shelter sits 30 feet above normal. The margin held. He paused. How did you know? I didn't. Silas looked at the mud-stained hillside, the debris scattered across the slope. I built as high as I could reach. I sealed as tight as I could seal. I buried it as deep as I could bury. And I prayed. Morgan nodded slowly. Can you show me how you did it? The sealing, the burial depth, the framing? Why? Because next time, I want to build something that survives. Word spread. Within a week, miners from Elkhart were making the trek up canyon to see the buried pipe. They came alone and in pairs, skeptical at first, then curious, then serious. They asked questions. They took notes. They measured the earth depth with sticks and paced the dimensions with their boots. Silas showed them everything: the oakum caulking, the tar waterproofing, the timber framing fitted inside the iron circumference, the stovepipe angle that ensured proper draft, the earth compaction technique that prevented settling. He did not charge. He did not lecture. He simply answered questions and let them draw their own conclusions. Greta Holtz came on the third day. She stood in the doorway of the shelter that she had once called a grave, running her hands along the caulked seams, feeling the solid iron beneath the timber. I lost everything, she said quietly. 18 years in this canyon. 3 homes, one after another. Floods took them all. She met his eyes. Could I build something like this? Something that would last? Not from iron, Silas said. There's no other boiler shell in the canyon. But the principles, the burial depth, the ceiling, the high ground, those would work with timber too. A proper dugout, built right, positioned right, would survive what just happened. You'll show me? If you want to learn, I'll teach you. She nodded once. Then she walked out into the spring sunlight to survey the hillside, already calculating where to dig. Thomas Caldwell came last. The superintendent had aged 10 years in a week. His daughter-in-law was dead. His mine was crippled. His authority, the iron certainty that had driven a vigilance committee to banish an innocent man, had crumbled like the buildings along the creek. He stood at the base of the hillside mound, looking up at the structure that had survived when everything he built had failed. The committee wants to convene, he said. His voice was flat, exhausted. Some of the men are saying you should be charged with trespassing. You never moved past the 2-mile limit. Technically, you violated the terms of your banishment. Silas waited. I told them no. Caldwell did not look at him. I told them the man built something that worked, and we should leave him be. Why? Caldwell was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because I buried my daughter-in-law yesterday. Because 3 of my miners are dead. Because everything I thought I knew about surviving in this canyon turned out to be wrong. He finally met Silas's eyes. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to say the banishment was unjust, but I'm not going to hunt you anymore. Build your pipe. Live your life. Just stay away from Elkhart. He turned and walked back down the canyon, a broken man in a broken landscape. It was not forgiveness. It was not justice. But it was enough. By autumn of 1887, 6 earth-bermed shelters had been constructed in Willow Creek Canyon, all positioned on high ground, all incorporating the techniques Silas had pioneered. Greta Holtz built a timber frame dugout with 6 feet of earth cover, 40 feet above the creek. When the moderate flood of 1891 tested it, not a drop of water seeped inside. Miners from 3 adjacent canyons traveled to see the original buried pipe. Silas showed them willingly. He never sold the design. He never sought credit. When a Creed newspaper wrote about the pipe hermit of Willow Creek, Silas did not respond. The buried boiler remained habitable until 1894, when a rock slide damaged the ventilation stack. By then, Silas had already gone. He left Willow Creek Canyon in the spring of 1892 and moved to a homestead in the Uncompahgre Valley, 60 miles west. He raised sheep. He lived alone. He never married, never returned to Elkhart, never spoke of the banishment or the flood or the men who had wronged him. In 1903, a traveler passing through Montrose noted meeting an old hermit named Crenshaw who spoke little but seemed at peace. Silas died in 1911, age 59. He was buried in an unmarked plot near his homestead. No one attended the burial. On May 14, 1887, the creek rose 12 feet in 40 minutes. Asa Morgan had warned him 7 months earlier, standing beside a useless lean-to while a banished man pretended he had a chance. You'll die alone, and no one will bury you. Silas Crenshaw did not die alone. He sat in the darkness of his buried pipe, feeling the earth shudder around him, listening to the roar of a flood that killed 5 people and erased a town. And he survived. When dawn came, he walked down to where Elkhart used to stand. The cabins of men who had banished him were mud and timber, scattered for miles downstream. The authority that had condemned him was buried under the same debris that choked the ruined creek. But 30 feet up the hillside, a column of smoke rose from an iron stovepipe. They had called him the Mole. They had called him a madman digging his own grave. The grave turned out to be the only home left standing,